Hey everyone, this is a piece by Paul Mattick titled "A Marxian Oddity." It's from Western Socialist, March-April 1958. In this review of a book by another Marxist, Mattick mocks the tendency of certain Marxists to project any notion onto Marx's writings, whether this is warranted or not. It is also notable for his dismissal of claims on how Marx can be fully understood by reading Hegel or some text by Marx published long after his death. For a biography, the book that's being reviewed is Marxism and Freedom, from 1776 until today, by Raya Dunayevskaya. I have a couple things on Raya Dunayevskaya on the channel, if you want to know more about her. In writing this strange book, the author's intentions were no doubt the best, but there is a wide gap between intentions and performance, and although Dunayevskaya's interpretation of Marxian doctrine is occasionally true and eloquent, the book as a whole is an embarrassing, scatterbrained hodgepodge of philosophical, economic, and political ideas that defy description and serious criticism. It may, however, serve as an example of how Marxism cannot be, quote, re-examined, end quote, and thus recovered from the Russians. The impulse for writing this book, the author relates, came from two sources, the American and East German workers. The American workers between 1950 and 1953, quote, began to come to grips with the realities of automation by moving the question of productivity from one dealing with wages to one dealing with the conditions of labor and the need for a totally new way of life, end quote. This was also the period, quote, when East German workers challenged the communist regime, end quote, and of a slave labor rising in Siberia, which sounded the tocsin, quote, for the beginning of the end of Russian totalitarianism, end quote. While the workers have established the, quote, unity of theory and practice, end quote, by their actual struggles and aspirations, the intellectuals are now urged to establish it in the realm of theory by reorganizing their thinking in the direction of a, quote, new humanism, end quote. This, quote, new humanism, end quote, however, is as old as and even older than Marxism and dates, in fact, from 1776. It is implicit in the Hegelian dialectic and was made explicit by Marx. As practice leads to theory, the Hegelian dialectic is seen as a product of the bourgeois revolution in both its political and economic aspects. Hegel also noticed the, quote, negative phenomenon, alienated labor, end quote, in capitalism, and Dunayevskaya finds this, quote, reminiscent of Marx's works, end quote, even though Hegel failed to see the, quote, positive elements of alienated labor, end quote. Dunayevskaya then plays with the concept of, quote, alienated labor, end quote, which for Marx became another expression for the workers divorced from the means of production, from control over production and production's products, and for a variety of consequences. Dunayevskaya's exposition, however, leads back into the murk of Hegelianism, where it gets lost in incomprehensible philosophical gibberish. While it serves no purpose to detect Hegelianism in the attitudes of today's workers and to discover their attitudes in Hegelian philosophy, Dunayevskaya's direct and indirect connection of both yields only the term, quote, freedom, end quote, as a synonym for the, quote, new humanism, end quote. But even if, according to Hegel, quote, freedom is the essence of mind, end quote, this tells us nothing with respect to the specific freedoms required for a socialist humanism. Dunayevskaya, unperturbed, however, points to the workers' opposition to both automation and totalitarian domination as the developing realization of men's essence, freedom. This opposition, Dunayevskaya says, contains the quest for a new type of labor that does away with the division of labor. It is true, of course, that Marx spoke of the end of the division of labor and even of labor itself. These, quote, these improbable, quote, goals, end quote, serve nonetheless to indicate the direction of further social development and humanization. Yet, what is of real concern is the abolition of class-determined capitalist division of labor. This does not spell the end of all labor division which is determined by social production. It should, however, lose its negative significance through social innovations and institutions, such as the increasing interchangeability of functions, which has eliminated its class connotations. Whereas the capitalist division of labor will disappear with capitalism, labor division of itself is not necessarily an obstacle to socialism. Neither does it need to stand in opposition to a concept of work as human activity that develops all of man's natural and acquired talents. It is even possible to describe socialism as the full realization of the positive possibilities inherent in the division of labor. When all kinds of labor are recognized as being of equal importance, it no longer matters what particular work the individual realizing his humanity and sociality is doing. However this problem may be resolved, it is obvious that associating it with current left-wing anti-Bolshevism, with automation, sit-down strikes, and bus boycotts is too far-fetched to have real meaning. It is mere wishful thinking on Dunayevskaya's part to see in these activities not only the beginning of proletarian self-determination, but also the manifestation of the dialectical movement towards absolute freedom, whatever that may mean. Apparently, Dunayevskaya lives in a semi-private world. Whatever happens in the real world or is said by some of its inhabitants, she looks at it or listens to it only to the extent that it justifies her own notions made up of Hegelian mysticism, Marxian economics, and Leninist demagogy. As regards Hegel, she contributes only fancy language without adding anything either to the understanding of Hegel or of the world at large. As regards Marx, interpretations are often deviations in order to fit Marxism into her own scheme of thought. According to Dunayevskaya, it is not capitalism which creates the capitalist division of labor, but rather the, quote, division of labor characteristic of all class societies, end quote, creates capital. When, quote, all science, all intellect, all skill goes into the machines while the labor of man becomes a simple monotonous grind, end quote, Dunayevskaya writes, quote, labor of man can produce nothing but its opposite, capital, end quote. But science, intellect, and skill are also part of the laboring process. Some workers produce machines, others produce other commodities with these machines, the very existence of which shows that not, quote, all concrete labors have been reduced to one abstract congealed mass, end quote. It is not, quote, dead accumulated materialized labor which oppresses living labor, end quote, in that literal sense in which Dunayevskaya conceives it, but the means of production as capital, owned or controlled by a definite social class, the subject of the working population and the capitalist as well to the vagaries of the competitive accumulation process and determine its anarchic character. In order to remain such, capitalists must accumulate regardless of actual social needs. In order to accumulate, capitalists must oppress the working class so that under capitalist production relations, the drive for additional capital appears as a production for the sake of production. This fetishistic situation, where the products of labor control their producers, exists only because of class relations under conditions of social production. Without these relations, the means of production are just that, unable to oppress anything. To be sure, Dunayevskaya also sees the, quote, mastery of dead over living labor, end quote, as a class relationship. But for her, quote, private property arises not because the products of labor are alienated from the laborer. That is only the consequence of the fact that his very activity is an alien activity, end quote. To restore, quote, the charm of work to work, end quote, requires, in Dunayevskaya's view, not only the end of class relations, but an entirely new type of labor, the character of which is not made clear. By now it is becoming clear what Dunayevskaya is driving at. The enemy today is state capitalism, the, quote, planned, end quote, capitalist society, which perpetuates the exploitative class relations of the capitalism of old. Planners, managers, and intellectuals have taken the controlling position formerly held by capitalists and continue the capitalist accumulation process for the sake of accumulation. To replace one set of, quote, planners, end quote, with another cannot affect the system. The transformation of state capitalism into the new humanism requires then a radical, total solution, abolishing the division of society into planners and planned, and the establishment of a, quote, new unity of manual and mental labor in the worker, end quote. Dunayevskaya detects a definite trend in this direction in every type of worker activity. But again, these activities are recognized only insofar as they support her own picture of the shape of things to come. For instance, Dunayevskaya celebrates the proletarian aspects of the East German and Hungarian risings, but she neglects to pay attention to their nationalist implications. She applauds the bus boycotts by Negroes in America's South. Dunayevskaya sees in them expressions of working-class self-activity and overlooks the striving for racial equality within the existing social system. Dunayevskaya supports, as is proper, sporadic wildcat and sit-down strikes, but fails to notice their relative insignificance within the total American situation and with a working class fully in the sway of capitalist ideology. Perhaps just because the total situation to the social problem lies for her in the faraway future. She looks for favorable evidence to support her position in the faraway past, in the muttering of Hegel, who both accepted and disliked the capitalist system and its industrialization. The dialectical unity of theory and practice, which is destined to culminate in a new unity of mental and manual work, Dunayevskaya demonstrates in great detail with Marx's Capital. While writing Capital, Marx decided, for strictly and clearly methodological reasons, to change its structure, to start all over again. Thus we have the first version in Critique of Political Economy and the second in Capital. According to Dunayevskaya, this change of plan was the result not of methodological consideration, but of the political upheavals of the time, and particularly of the workers' struggle for a shorter working day. In this manner, the workers themselves participated in producing Capital, the book, which in turn could not have been written in the way it was without their participation. I'm curious, I'd have to look at the footnotes, but I'm wondering if this observation at all influenced Peter Berelhardt's chapter on Dunayevskaya and C.L.R. James in his book Trotskyism, and I think it's called Trotskyism, the Transition to Socialism. I don't know, I've been reading chapters out of that book. I'm actually almost done, I should have probably finished the book. But he precisely says the same thing. It's like, Dunayevskaya tries to, take, ground, in this instance, is she's trying to ground. I mean, I haven't read it, so I can't speak on it myself. But basically, what they're both saying here and in Berelhardt's is that she tries to make the argument that capital was some kind of direct reflection of combativity of labor in that period of time, as opposed to dealing with very abstract theoretical problems of presentation and articulation of things such as the commodity, especially, and value and money. Those basic, especially this, it seems to me, especially those basic introductory chapters in Capital that explain commodity fetishism, value, and money. I think those she tries to make it sound like the book was some text that was directly the result of worker struggles at the time, which is it's an extremely big leap that I don't think can be grounded in, and I think Mattick here agrees, and so does Berelhardt, that that's not sustainable. That's not an argument that could be sustained. So where was I in the text? According to Dunayevskaya, this change of plan was the result not of methodological considerations, but of the political upheavals of the time, and particularly of the workers' struggle for a shorter working day. In this manner, the workers themselves participated in producing Capital, which in turn could not have been written in the way it was without their participation. As a revolutionary socialist, Marx could not very well overlook the workers and their struggle, since it was their plight that first led him to analyze capitalist society. What is too obvious to be worth mentioning, Dunayevskaya presents, however, as her own and as a new discovery, quoting chapter and page to show that because there was a struggle for a shorter working day, Marx, quote, made this the historical framework of capitalism itself, end quote. Well, in the Critique of Political Economy of 1859, quote, history is the history of theory, end quote, Dunayevskaya writes, quote, in Capital, history is the history of class struggle, end quote. As if Marx's writings prior to the Critique and down to the Communist Manifesto never existed. In Dunayevskaya's view, furthermore, not only the workers' aspirations, but all struggles for, quote, freedom, end quote, associated one way or another with the laboring classes, determined the content and structure of capital. Quote, it wasn't Marx, end quote, Dunayevskaya says, quote, who decided that the Civil War in the United States was a holy war. It was the working class of England, the very ones who suffered the most, who decided that, end quote. Later it is the Paris Commune, quote, that illuminates and deepens the content of capital, end quote. As the, quote, treason of the ruling classes necessitates the saving of French civilization by the proletariat, end quote. French civilization, Dunayevskaya says, was saved from Bismarck and the French Quislings through the abolition of the, quote, division of labor between the legislative and executive, end quote, and the transformation of parliament, quote, from a talking to a working body, end quote, and thus the commune, quote, created new conditions of labor, end quote. And so it goes on and on from one fantasy to another, alternating between sheer nonsense and mere misunderstandings, interrupted by valid statements that look silly in this amazing melee of contradictions and half-truths. Abstractions are taken for concrete realities. For instance, quote, abstract labor, end quote, which is not related to labor itself, but to the fact that all kinds of labor differ only qualitatively in the capitalist exchange process. The Marxian concept of total capital and his model of the system as presented in Capital is regarded not as a mental construction, but as an actual, quote, national, end quote, capital, in distinction to, quote, private, end quote, or, quote, world capital, end quote. And thus Dunayevskaya is able to identify, quote, aggregate capitalist, end quote, with Russian state capitalism, and to declare that Marx was the first anti-Bolshevik who predicted the collapse of the totalitarian economy. The astonishing part of Dunayevskaya's book, the most astonishing part of Dunayevskaya's book, however, is her treatment of Lenin. Quote, confronted with the appearance of counter-revolution, the Second International, within the revolutionary movement, end quote, Dunayevskaya says, quote, Lenin was driven to search for a philosophy that could restore his own reason, end quote. End quote, as soon as Lenin opened The Science of Logic by Hegel, end quote, quote, Lenin grasped the importance of dialectics, end quote. Lenin came to the conclusion, as he himself stated, that, quote, it is impossible completely to grasp Marx's Capital. You need something?
Dinner's ready when you want to eat.
Okay, I'll be in a second.
Whenever you want. It's just chilly.
Okay, cool. ... If you have not studied through and understood, Lenin came to the conclusion, as Lenin himself stated, that, quote, it is impossible completely to grasp Marx's Capital if you have not studied through and understood the whole of Hegel's logic, end quote. Consequently, Lenin added, quote, none of the Marxists for the past half-century have understood Marx, end quote. It was a good thing that Lenin opened Hegel's logic. If Lenin had not opened Hegel's logic, there would not have been a true Marxist for a whole century, until the day, that is, when Dunayevskaya herself opened the logic. Sharing the Hegelian key to Marx with Lenin, Dunayevskaya has a rather difficult time reconciling Lenin's authoritarianism with her own concept of the, quote, spontaneous self-organization of the proletariat, end quote. I'm going to say right now, I don't know what the rest of this thing is, there's only one page left here, but I'm going to say that there's a very important essay on my channel that also hasn't gotten a lot of views. I don't know if I said that, but not gotten a lot of views. It's from, like, when I first started recording audiobooks. It's titled the historical problems, the problems with C.L.R. James's historical interpretation of Lenin. C.L.R. James basically tries to whitewash Lenin and rewrite him as abandoning the workers, as abandoning the vanguard party notion towards the end of his life, and also that he was, some sense, like a Democrat, some kind of democratic extremist who, you know, every cook can govern, being like, I believe that's a Lenin quote, being like the core of Lenin's philosophy, which based upon an entirety of interpretation of Lenin's output, is extremely dubious, and especially when it is considered Lenin's role in the authoritarian moves of the Bolshevik Party. It totally decimates C.L.R. James's kind of like whitewashing or like understanding of Lenin. I mean, it's great that C.L.R. James, at least in certain points of his life, was in favor of like direct democratic socialism and working class self-activity and self-management and all those kinds of things that are like great. But he tries to include Lenin in that tradition, and I don't think there's place for Lenin in that tradition. I think that the work that also the piece that's on my channel by, I think think it's Babak Amini. I can't remember his name, but it's about the history up to 1917 of the conception of workers' control in post-Marx Marxism. And if you listen to the section on Lenin, it's not very flattering. And I think that it causes a problem because, especially if you look at, like there's that map of libertarian socialist tendencies that's on the LibCom website that was written by Chris Wright, who's obviously not a Leninist, but he includes Lenin in that kind of like web of libertarian socialist political philosophy because ostensible libertarians, well maybe not ostensible, is too cruel of a word, especially in the case of Dunayevskaya, but people coming from the Johnson Forest tendency drew from Lenin, and so did, I guess, people, I don't know if this is included in the chart, but so did people like communization type people draw from like the Bordiga, who is influenced highly by Lenin. I think there's a very deep problem in that. I think that I don't think you can include Lenin and Trotsky and people like that in the tradition of libertarian socialism at all, unless maybe it's a little more complicated with Trotsky. I don't think it actually is complicated with Trotsky, but Trotsky had a very pretty substantial critique of substitutionism when he was still a Menshevik and not a Bolshevik. And he wrote a pretty like profound critique of like Bolshevism in like the early, I think it's probably like 1905 or something like that, about like the critique of substitutionism, how the substitution of the party becomes substitutionism of a central committee, and then that becomes the substitution of a single man for the rule of the dictatorship of the proletariat, and something like that in his early writings. But I don't think you can't really fit Leninism into that tradition. So I think I don't know what's actually going to be said in the rest of this, but those are just some thoughts to myself. Anyway, sharing the Hegelian key to Marx with Lenin, Dunayevskaya has a rather difficult time reconciling Lenin's authoritarianism with her own concept of the, quote, spontaneous self-organization of the proletariat, end quote. After all, Lenin was the founder of the, quote, vanguard party, end quote, and the promoter of the party dictatorship. Lenin did not care for a spontaneity which makes life difficult for the professional revolutionist and interferes with state planning. But Dunayevskaya managed just the same to turn Lenin into his exact opposite. Prior to his taking power, there are some statements of Lenin's that woo and flatter the rebellious masses and encourage them to act spontaneously. But in contrast to this stand the Leninist authoritarian theory and practice in relation to Lenin's own party, to other organizations, and as the party in power, in relation to the working class. All this Dunayevskaya either ignores or twists out of recognition, so that Lenin emerges as the greatest of all anti-Bolsheviks, who, quote, never at any time had any conception of the party as an elite in the sense in which our age uses the term, end quote. Unfortunately, however, neither Stalin nor any of the other Bolshevik leaders opened Hegel's logic, and thus, according to Dunayevskaya, Leninism became Stalinism and state capitalism, the greatest enemy of the new humanism. What remains to be said is that the book has appendices consisting of fragmentary early writings of Marx on private property and communism as a piece, and the Hegelian dialectic. They represent a stage of Marx's intellectual development which he himself was glad to get behind him. And though they are of some interest, as is almost anything that Marx wrote, they do not enhance the understanding of either Marxism or capitalism. The last appendix is a translation of Lenin's Abstracts of Hegel's Science of Logic, marginal notes made for Lenin's own use while reading this work. Although they have perhaps their place in a complete collection of Lenin's works, by themselves they are of small importance and will really fascinate only those who indulge in collecting scraps of manuscript, letters, autographs, doodles, and even the cigarette butts of famous men. It's fucking hilarious. Thanks for listening.